Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Israel Dialogues. For those I've not had a chance to meet yet, I'm Rabbi Zachary Goodman here with Holy Blossom Temple. We are so grateful that you're joining us again today with Mark Keller, as well as standing panelists, talk about Israel and Arab normalization. As always, I just wanted to say hello and start with a word of gratitude to our sponsors, a word of gratitude to our speakers today, to do a bit of housekeeping as well. So if at any time during the session you have questions for our panelists, please do write your question into the Q&A function. The Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Rather than writing in the chat, please pose your questions in the Q&A. We should be together for about an hour and a half. And with that, I'm going to invite onto screen David DeWitt to help set the stage for our time together this afternoon or evening for those joining from Israel and around the world.
Right. Thanks so much. It's always a pleasure to welcome everyone who have registered and are active viewers in the Israel Dialogues. Today, we're thrilled to have Mark Keller with us. He originates from Toronto, and I'm going to leave the full introduction to my colleague, Mark Anshin. But before I do, I should note that aside from the fact that I've known Mark and worked with him for many, many, many years, that he has a particularly important place in the scholarship having to do with Israel and its future, because back in 1983, it may well have been the first, certainly I think, if not the first, among the very first books that put forward a thesis about a Palestinian state and the implications for Israel. And he published that in 1983. And then it was followed shortly afterwards with an equally important statement, which he co-authored with a distinguished Palestinian scholar, Sari Nusseibeh. And that book was called No Trumpets, No Drums, a two-state settlement of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Now that's obviously not Mark's focus in today's presentation, but I dare say that the issue of Israel-Arab normalization has an impact on the issue of Israel-Palestine, and perhaps we'll have an opportunity to explore that. With that, let me please turn this over to Mark Anshin.
Thank you. Thank you, David, and thanks to everyone for being with us today. Wishing a good Shabbat Shalom for the coming weekend. I'd like to begin by introducing our guest today, Professor Mark Keller, originally from Toronto, made Aliyah quite a long time ago. Let me just briefly introduce him. Professor Keller is a principal research associate at the Institute for National Security Studies at Tel Aviv University, and he's a non-resident scholar at the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C. He received his BA in political science and economics at the University of Toronto, did his graduate studies at Harvard, where he earned an MA in Middle Eastern Studies and a PhD in political science. He's been affiliated with the Institute for National Security Studies, the Jaffe Center, since 1979, and he's taught international relations at Tel Aviv University and at several American universities, including Cornell and Harvard. He's also served as coordinator of research at the Canadian Institute for International Peace and Security, research associate at the International Institute for Strategic Studies, public policy scholar at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, and a visiting fellow at the German Institute for International Security Affairs in Berlin. As David has mentioned, he's written extensively on Middle Eastern political and strategic issues in Israel and foreign and academic journalist and published in foreign and academic journals. We're very pleased and privileged to have him with us today. And Mark, we're very grateful for your time being with us at this hour in Israel. And I'll now turn it over to you. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, David and Mark and Zachary for the invitation and for the kind introduction. I would like to take advantage of this meeting just to make a few introductory remarks about this issue of Israel-Arab normalization, and then leave as much time as possible for follow-up questions and discussion. Let me first of all say, however, that at first glance, it seems a bit bizarre to be addressing this issue today, a day when a couple of thousand kilometers away from Israel, events are taking place that justifiably monopolize our attention now because they are of truly cosmic and globe-shaping significance. Now, one might think that's just kind of serendipity that it's happening. But actually, on closer investigation, I think there may well be some organic connection between these things, between this question of Israel-Arab normalization and what is now happening in Eastern Europe, in the sense that they may both grow out of the shifting nature of the world order, and more particularly, I would argue, out of the end of the unipolar moment in modern history. So let me back up a bit and try to sharpen the resolution. When we address this issue of normalization, at this stage, of course, we're focused on Israeli relations, in the first instance anyway, with the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain. And we rightly stipulate normalization rather than peace. The choice of the title was conscious, because Israel and these two countries were never really at war, either de jure or de facto. There was, it was true, a diplomatic boycott over the years by the Gulf states, and they did refrain from formal recognition, even as they, along with several others, maintained a variety of under-the-table ties and informal contacts. So what happened in 2020, towards the end of the year with the so-called Abraham Accords, was that formal recognition did not create these ties as much as it made it possible to bring them out of the closet and to expand and proliferate them in the light of day. And that's what we really mean by normalization. Now, as a result of those agreements, economic interactions grew very quickly. Direct investment exploded, direct travel and people-to-people contacts and cultural exchanges also multiplied to the point where Dubai is now one of Israelis' favorite holiday destinations. And secondly, the cover of the legitimation provided by the UAE and Bahrain permitted the intensification of existing ties with Israel's cold peace partners, Egypt and Jordan, and the extension of relations to other normalization partners, such as Sudan and Morocco. Here's a case in point. Over the course of 1 year, from 2020 to 2021, in just 1 year, the total volume of Israel's foreign trade grew by about 25%. Now, that growth, of course, is partly attributable to the relaxation of some of the most rigorous COVID restrictions. Everybody's foreign trade expanded. But that effect was not felt evenly across the board. In contrast to the overall growth of 25%, trade with Egypt grew by 43%, with Jordan by 83%, with Morocco by 84%, and with the UAE by a stunning 511%, if you can believe it. And trade with Bahrain in 2021 stood at only $6.5 million US, but in 2020, it was zero. so we can't even get a percentage growth rate. Now, I don't think we really need to probe very deeply into Israel's motives for pursuing normalization. I would suggest beyond and probably above the material benefits, one ought to point first to the psychological benefit of eroding the sense of isolation and rejection by its neighbors that Israel had traditionally experienced. To this, I think one could add, especially on the right of the political spectrum, the belief in the possibility of breakthroughs in the region based on mutual interests without major concessions to the Palestinians had been vindicated. All of that is fairly banal and self-evident. I think a bit less obvious are the Arab motivations. First of all, one might ask why it became possible then to pursue self-interest with little more than lip service to the Palestinian cause after decades during which that was not politically possible. Well, I think what weakened the nostrum that state interests needed to be mortgaged to Palestinian interests, one explanation was simply the passage of time. Egypt, after all, had publicly and explicitly subordinated the Palestinian cause to state interests 40 years before. For a while, Egypt had been excoriated in the rest of the Arab world for that act, even expelled from the Arab League. But Egyptian isolation eroded as circumstances changed, and Egypt was eventually rehabilitated, perhaps even more than it had any desire to be. Secondly, during those 40 years, other Arab states increasingly tired of what they, or many of them at least, viewed as Palestinian obstructionism and rejectionism, not to speak of the habit of being swept away by regional figures like Saddam Hussein or Recep Tayyip Erdogan, of whom most Arab leaders did not think too highly. Now, evidence of that sort of attitude can be found in very graphic description of Palestinian failings given by former longtime Saudi ambassador to the United States and later head of Saudi intelligence, Bandar bin Sultan, in a series of interviews in Al Arabiya newspaper in late 2020. Responding to Palestinian descriptions of the Abraham Accords as a betrayal, Bandar turned the critical gun around and leveled it at Palestinian leaders over the decades who had consistently made it impossible, he charged, for other Arabs to do anything really to help them. Another factor connected with the passage of time was, in the Gulf at least, was generational change. Whole new generations of local residents had grown up after many of the most dramatic Arab-Israeli conflicts that had electrified public sentiment. And they were increasingly focused not on the high politics of Arab-Israeli relations, but rather on what you could call the low politics of integrating themselves into a modernizing, technologically advanced consumer society world in which all of the emotional appeals of the Palestinian issue really began not to resonate quite so much. So that is, I think, the first level of explanation. I think a second motivation for the Arab states was the intensification towards the early part of the 21st century of the needs which normalization might help satisfy. Now, these needs are partly economic in the sense that even resource-rich states increasingly appreciated the attractiveness of access to Israeli technology and expertise in their desire to diversify their economies in anticipation of a future world potentially less addicted to hydrocarbons. Examples include cooperation in AR, artificial intelligence, in water management, in arid zone agriculture, fintechs, pharmaceuticals, and so on. However, even more urgent than those economic needs were the needs generated by security threats. The dimensions of those threats vary from terrorism through cyber attacks and UAV or drone attacks to domestic subversion and sabotage, either by direct action or by proxy forces. But whatever the nature of the threat, the main source of them was increasingly seen as Iran. Now, Iranian assertiveness throughout the region, from Lebanon through Syria and Iraq down to Yemen and the Red Sea, has, even more than anxieties about Iran's nuclear ambitions, convinced the Gulf states that they need to intensify their efforts to conciliate Iran while simultaneously maximizing their ability to contain Iranian influence and action, both through their own capacities and through cooperation with and support from others. All of this brings us back to geopolitics, to which I intimated at the outset. Ever since the British retreat in the early 1970s from what was euphemistically called East of Suez, others for the Gulf states has meant the United States. And for most of that period, the United States has been a powerful and reliable provider of security, the security that the Gulf states need, but can't generate on their own. The most graphic example of this, of course, was the American war in 1991 to liberate Kuwait from Iraqi occupation, a war that involved the sending of almost 500,000 American armed forces halfway around the world. In recent years, however, the power and the reliability of the American protector has been seen to diminish, just when activist leaders of former Middle Eastern empires, Turkey and especially Iran, and Islamic radicals seem to be bent on making their countries or their causes great again. And after costly and inconclusive wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, America was rapidly tiring of the Middle East and of most other foreign entanglements as well, one should add, kind of echo of George Washington's farewell address. Just as other non-regional powers increasingly asserted themselves in the world and showed, at least in the case of Russia and Syria, a kind of old new determination to intervene directly on behalf of their troubled clients or proteges, something that the Americans were no longer willing to do. And this is not confined to any particular administration, contrary to what some Republicans are now claiming. It is, and it long predates the withdrawal from Afghanistan. It was certainly the case when the credibility of American commitments was undermined by the refusal of Barack Obama to follow through on his threat that the use of chemical weapons by Bashar al-Assad would cross a red line, and then did nothing about that in 2015-16. Perhaps the most dramatic contrast, however, with Russia in this respect was provided by the passivity of President Trump following the September 2019 missile attacks on the Abqaiq refinery and oil fields in Saudi Arabia, attacks which were almost universally attributed to Iran or its proxies. Well, it's therefore not surprising, I think, that perceptions of weakening American power and or American steadfastness provoked a growing sense of vulnerability among Arab states in the Gulf, the obverse, it might be argued, of greater Iranian opportunism, and prompted them to begin looking for additional security partners. Now, given its capabilities and its shared baleful view of Iran's role in the region, Israel was the logical candidate. And that is the third major Arab motivation for normalization. Of course, there's no delusion that Israel could ever replace the United States in terms of its resources and deployments, or its sense of regional and global responsibilities. Israel will never send large expeditionary forces to fight for others in major conflicts. It can, however, contribute a great deal to cooperative security efforts by sharing intelligence product analysis and threat assessments, technology in air and missile defense or cybernetic defense, and training. Indeed, Israeli naval and air forces have already participated in joint exercises under American aegis, a trend facilitated by the transfer of Israel from European to Central Command. Well, these developments suggest the possibility, to me at least, of more serious multilateral cooperation in the Middle East, in both economic and security matters, something that has been historically absent in the region and can come closer to fulfilling its potential only when the major missing element, Saudi Arabia, is also brought into the mix. Of course, it's difficult to estimate the likelihood of that happening, and it may well depend on the passing of King Salman, the last of the old guard, and the creation as well, despite everything, of some kind of Palestinian fig leaf. The benefits of normalization are being reaped even without such a breakthrough. But if that does happen, it could signify a much more substantial, and one ought to concede, unpredicted upside of the creeping American retrenchment from the world, not wholesale retreat or isolationism, I have to stress, but an undeniably more modest American role in international relations. And now, to close the circle and go back to where we started from, can be argued, I think, quite plausibly, that Vladimir Putin's sense of American hesitancy over the last 3 administrations does help explain much of Russian behavior in the Middle East, and more dramatically, of course, now in the Ukraine. It's far more difficult, it's probably impossible actually, to estimate whether there may in the end be a similarly unpredicted upside to the crisis engulfing Europe and the rest of the world now. All things considered, my sense is that the prospects are not promising, and the risks of uncertainty there are much, much higher. But I'll leave all that to another day and another forum, and stop now and throw it open for discussion.
Thank you very much, Mark, for your analysis and your commentary. Very insightful. I'll start with one question, and then we'll go to our panel, our group that is with us, and then we'll open it up to questions from the participants that are with us today. And my one question is, early on in your presentation, you mentioned that Saudi Arabia responded to the Palestinian reaction to the Abraham Accords. I think you were talking about the Saudi Arabian former ambassador, who took issue with how the Palestinian community or Palestinian Authority had reacted to the Abraham Accords. That seems to indicate that Saudi Arabia does view the Abraham Accords with some degree of positivity. And then you indicated later on that it's still as uncertain as to when Saudi Arabia will join the Accords. Can you sort of say a little bit more about that in terms of the response indicating positive in response to the accords, but sort of hesitating at this point? Is that more because of the current leadership of Saudi Arabia?
Do you want me to respond individually to each of these? Yeah, okay. Well, look, I think that, Saudi politics are a little bit obscure, opaque, but there is some sense that there is an openness among younger members of the Saudi royal family, especially MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, and also kind of younger generation of more educated and westernized Saudis to move along a similar track. And there have therefore been, as evidence of that, kind of reports of indirect contacts, discussions, intermediaries back and forth, attempts by Jared Kushner to try to push this along, and even some material, I would say, gestures along that line, most particularly the opening of Saudi airspace to Israeli aircraft going towards the Gulf and further into the Far East. But there is a lot of foot dragging and resistance as well. As you know, I'm sure there are stronger traditional conservative religious elements in Saudi Arabia than there are in UAE or Bahrain. And there is also, unlike in almost any other country, top power still held by people whose formative experiences were in the 1930s and 40s, if you can believe that. And so I think my sense, other things being equal, which they never are, that with the passage of time, that trend will strengthen. But as I say, we'll probably need the king to go to a better place, and we'll need some kind of fig leaf to make it politically acceptable.
Thank you. Dylan or David, do you have a question or comments?
Sure.
David, go ahead.
May I just add one more point on that question? We'll
Yeah.
probably need also need an American administration that's willing to close the books on the Jamal Khashoggi issue as a kind of incentive to drag the Saudis across the finish line.
Right. Good point. Yeah.
Yeah.
David.
Mark, I'd like you to expand a little bit on how this all plays into the Israeli-Palestinian environment. I mean, you spoke about it very interestingly in your remarks. I'd love to be the skeptic here, where I'm usually optimistic and want to look for diplomatic opportunities. But I wonder whether, given the constraints and the limited, at the moment, a limited envelope of opportunities, moving beyond relatively narrowly defined national interests, including economics and security, whether or not there's enough there yet to take on the very touchy and potentially volatile issue of Israel-Palestine. The Saudi Arab initiative, that was what, 20 years ago now. So it was, I thought, a creative initiative, but of course it contained the requirement that all these things couldn't happen until there was a Palestinian-Israeli resolution that was acceptable to both parties.
Exactly.
We're not there. So I'm wondering how you see this, the Abraham Accords, and assuming that they can deepen and strengthen in terms of the economics and security, whether they really will be able to move into that diplomatic uncertainty, given what I understand is significant difference still between the elites in the Arab partner countries versus the public in those same countries, and of course the Islamization issue. So it's big
Well,
question.
I mean, you know as well as anyone, David, that there's a lot of obscurity judging two things. One, what is Arab public opinion in general and on this issue in particular? And two, how important is Arab public opinion in influencing governmental outcomes? Now, obviously, it's not irrelevant because like even the most repressive governments anywhere, they invest a lot of effort in trying to persuade people to express themselves properly or to refrain from expressing themselves improperly and molding their opinions appropriately. And therefore, a lot of what we say about this issue is really based on kind of impressionistic evidence rather than solid data. But I think that it's not so much a question of approval or disapproval as how indifferent people are, or how engaged they are. And I think the further away they get from the core of the issue and the more that time goes by, there's a growing indifference. I mean, relative to the stakes they have and whatever benefit, material benefit they think they need and can get from normalization. Look, Sudan was brought along, at least formally and technically, basically because the government felt that it was essential to get the US administration to take them off the list of states supporting terrorism. The Moroccans were brought along because they thought for some reason that it was really essential to get the Americans to agree to legitimize the Moroccan occupation of Western Sahara. Those were the payoffs, and they were deemed valuable enough to overcome whatever opposition there might have been domestically, because the indifference curve had shifted over time. I don't know how likely that is to continue or to strengthen in other Arab countries. As I said, it all depends on how other things are equal. My guess is that if we just do a kind of linear projection, it will continue to move in that direction, provided there's no new crisis and no new explosion and no new round of huge casualties or anything like that. And look, there's some, evidence of expressions of even resentment of being mortgaged to the Palestinians. Even 40 years ago, Sadat was able to bring the Egyptian public along by saying, we're tired of dying for the Palestinian cause. And a lot of others may also say we're tired of making sacrifices or giving up benefits we could get otherwise for the Palestinian cause.
Thank you. Dylan, please.
So thanks, Mark. Continuing along the same vein vis-a-vis the Israel-Palestinian conflict, what are your thoughts on the impact of this kind of normalization were it to continue, especially if a Saudi Arabia were to be brought in vis-a-vis the Palestinians? And I guess on one side, you see the argument that I think Palestinians have made that they're being left behind and people are leaving them or taking chips off the table in terms of negotiations. And on the other hand, and I guess I tend to at least wonder if there may be a silver lining there, that for Israel, the existential question of its existence in the Middle East, if it's removed by its neighbors, I wonder if it actually opens up a bit of an avenue for peace and negotiation with the Palestinians. So I wonder your thoughts on that.
Well, look, there was a lot of speculation immediately after all these accords were signed that, yeah, it might actually to contribute to some kind of outcome of that sort, because it took, as you say, took Palestinian chips off the table. The Palestinians could no longer say, as they had for many years, justifiably so, I think, we hold the key to Israeli acceptance by the Arab world. And therefore, whatever our military or economic weakness may be, we're in a strong bargaining position nevertheless. And the assumption was, if they could no longer make that assumption, they might become more amenable to flexibility or concessions or something else. I don't see any evidence that that has happened yet. In any case, the what you call the existential threat to Israel has really shifted away from the Arab hinterland of the Palestinians, and it's no longer an Arab issue anymore. It's an Iranian question, particularly an Iranian nuclear question. That's the only real existential threat that Israel faces, apart from domestic disarray.
Thank you. Rabbi Goodman, could you let John Allen join us? He's able to join us now, and he may have some comments or questions as well while we're waiting for John to join us. There, David or Dylan, do you have any other thoughts or questions you want to pose at this point before we go to Q&A?
Sure. I mean, I think Mark has opened up so many interesting uncertainties when we look.
Can of worms, you're about to say, right?
One is, in your fleeting moments of optimism around all this, can you imagine a regional security regime or environment emerging, given Iran as a common threat or destabilizing factor? It's not just Iran as Iran, but it's Iran in terms of creating Syria as a proxy state, Iran in Lebanon, Iran across Yemen, and indeed Iran in other parts of the world, and now Iran with them as playing very astute politics with both the Chinese and the Russians. Did you see this providing the basis for the emergence of a regional security arrangement?
Look, I have an instinctive suspicion of terms like regime. Never quite sure what that actually means.
Right.
But I do believe that the biggest impetus to cooperation among different entities is the existence of a common threat, common concern. And therefore, even if nothing ever gets formalized, and I would be very surprised if we ever get to the point of something equivalent to a Middle East regional security alliance, there is, I think, a fertile ground for expanding and deepening cooperation. And it's not just ad hoc, it could be institutionalized in the form of regular consultations and regular, I mean, I know these, this Israeli defense minister has been all over the place the last month or two in Bahrain and Morocco and who knows where else he's gone to. I think, as I say, there's a fertile ground for this sort of thing. Yes, with Iran as the focus. But it will still need, notwithstanding its lower profile, it will still need American orchestration.
Mhm.
Thank you. John Allen has joined us. Welcome, John. Sorry you're with us. Great to have you with us. Do you have any questions or comments that you want to jump into? Can't hear you right now.
He's muted, I think.
Yeah, I think you're muted. Yeah, you're muted.
Hi, Mark.
Yeah.
Hello, John. How are you?
Very good. Long time no see.
It is indeed.
It is, yeah.
Why isn't your hair
2010.
white?
It's because I don't have any.
Ah, okay.
Anyways, no, I don't have any questions right now. Thanks so much. I'm sorry I had a board meeting.
Okay.
ahead.
So why don't we, there's two questions that have come in from our participants. Let me start with the first one from Amnon Zohar, and I'll just read it. Says, I'm of the opinion that solving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is a regional responsibility, not only Israel's. And now, if you agree, then is it possible that a Middle East union or an alliance of the moderates is the answer or solution once Saudi Arabia were to normalize relations with Israel? And if so, how? Sort of relates a bit to your final comment there about the potential of a Middle East kind of security cooperative council. But, you want to respond to that?
Okay, I think it's a very legitimate and appealing proposal. And in fact, it was the logic that underlay efforts 30 years ago to address this on a multilateral basis. You'll remember we had this structure set up after the Madrid Peace Conference of bilateral talks in parallel with multilateral talks on the assumption that expanding the circle of participation would somehow enhance the prospects of reaching agreement. It didn't work out then, and I'm not sure if we have yet figured out why, what the missing ingredients were. It's a question of always of locating that elusive, correct mix of incentives and disincentives, bringing in the other Arabs into the mix rests on the assumption that they can somehow change the dynamic of the Israeli-Palestinian interaction. It's intrinsically appealing idea, but I haven't yet seen how it can be operationalized. I haven't yet seen any important Arab actor willing and able to bring about a decisive shift in the negotiating posture of the Palestinians.
Good. Any reaction to that response, or I'll go to the next question. Next question is from Elliot Jacobson. Professor Heller, you mentioned a number of reasons or causes why the Gulf states were in need or interested in cooperation with support from another actor other than the US, and Israel was well placed to provide that support. So Elliot asked, what is or what was the role of the Trump administration in bringing about these accords to happen?
Well, look, if there was a coherent approach of the Trump administration to this or any other issue in international affairs, it was to be disruptive. It was to undermine continuing belief in traditional approaches to things. So, yeah, the Trump administration really shook things up. And I think it was on the positive side of the ledger, it was willing to push this hard and to hold out all kinds of incentives and all kinds of promises and really to move things forward. But like everything else connected with the Trump administration, there's another side to it. And the other side was how should I call it? the positive contribution of American negativism, by which I mean the growing concern, I think I alluded to it before, that the America of Donald Trump was intensifying the inclination towards, I mean, not to put too fine a cast on it, towards isolationism. They were just not interested. Trump was just not interested in engaging the United States in anything except selling and, I mean, improving the American balance of trade. And therefore, even as he or they or his representatives, and especially Jared Kushner, pushed hard for this breakthrough, and it was a breakthrough, they were also strengthening the incentive of the Arab states who felt some degree of insecurity to look for alternative sources of security assistance and support. They just didn't trust, they just stopped trusting the United States as much as they did before. And as I say, I don't think Trump is responsible for this. This is a continuation or an intensification of a trend which began to emerge, I think, you know, the minute I think the Iraq war went bad. And the minute that, you know, it was long before Trump when Barack Obama was talking about endless, useless wars. And when Barack Obama didn't keep his word to punish Bashar al-Assad, people just didn't feel there was a reliable support anymore from Washington.
Thank you. We have some other questions from our panel, and then we have another question from one of our participants. I'll go to David, and then John will follow up with you. David?
Yeah, Mark, I take what you're saying, and I think I agree with much of it. But so let me push you further on this. When I try and put myself within the region which you and others live, and ask what are alternatives to the US, my initial response is it's not alternatives to, but alternatives in addition to trying to make things attractive to keep the US in which there are remaining strategic interests the Americans have. And part of that remaining interest is in fact blunting or constraining the alternatives that Arab states may turn to, the Chinese and the Russians, maybe in India as well, or Pakistan. Is that a dynamic which you can imagine Israel playing some very creative and positive politics through its economics, through its technologies, through its security apparatus, to strengthen its position and to strengthen the notion of if not a regional alliance, a regional consensus on where are the points of danger and disruption? Because my sense is after the last decade in the Arab world, the idea of further dramatic dislocation and disruption is not seen to be something that anybody wants. They want growth and stability. So
you're absolutely right.
Does this? But then does this create an environment in which Israel could in fact take not just the external diplomatic risks, but the internal ones? What I'm speaking, of course, with the issue of using this new shell as a way to reconstruct the Israel-Palestine relationship and something that's less antagonistic. Or is that way off the mark, that this is just going to continue to drift so long as the generational problem, the leadership problem exists?
Well, I have to confess, David, it's hard for me to get a firm grip on any of this. I'm not sure I understand anymore what people mean when they talk about America, since it's so fractured and partisan and divided. And I have to say, increasingly thinking the same thing about Israel is also, tremendous divisiveness, just kind of barely contained. And there's hardly a more divisive issue than the Palestinian issue in terms of policy choices. There are underlying strata which have more to do with identity and self-awareness than they do with policy choices, but that's also another thing. No, I don't think that there is either a ability or willingness to look for a different paradigm. And therefore, if the idea that you're raising is, shift things around with the Palestinians in order, to entice the Americans to remain more in the region, I think it's probably a non-starter. I'm guessing also that the type of Americans who would be most likely to be enticed by that sort of change are probably also the ones who are least likely to be reliable security partners, without naming any names.
Thank you. Good. John.
But there are four
Oh,
of
sorry.
them.
I'll go micro, and I don't know what I've missed, so I apologize if I'm going over some ground that's been covered, and I kind of think I may be because you've talked about the absence of leadership or hinted at the absence of leadership, but let me take you out of your comfortable sphere of regional dynamics into your personal view. Is the two-state solution dead? I'm talking to you as an Israeli citizen. And apart from the Iranian existential threat, which is real and we all recognize, is there an internal domestic threat that we've heard from some of our other speakers to the Jewish and democratic nature of the country? And so just, where do you see this playing out, and do Israelis generally, or what percentage of Israelis see this as a problem, and what percentage don't? Thank you.
Oh, well, I'll give you, first of all, let me back up, John, and say that the zone I'm in personally is not all that comfortable, so you don't have to take me out of a comfort zone. Look, there are very serious threats to, I think, to domestic coherency and viability. Threats to some kind of consensus about the validity of the constitutional order and the political system. We don't yet have people challenging the validity of election results, but we do have very serious challenges to the legitimacy of the judicial system, of the Supreme Court, of hidden control, dark forces controlling media and things like that. I personally think there is a serious problem, and I think the serious problem, fortunately, is still recognized, I guess is the rough estimate, by about 55 or 60% of the people, as opposed to the rest who are part of the challenge. So yeah, it's something that causes a lot of people concern, me including myself. The only, I mean, the major source of comfort, if that's what it is for Israelis, is their awareness of the fact that the phrase they used to use to describe Israel's problems was in a properly run country, this wouldn't happen. Growing realization that there aren't many other properly run countries either. And at least it gives some sense of perspective. We can't run away from these problems because there's nowhere to run to get away from the problems, except maybe, I don't know, Finland or New Zealand. And therefore, you really have no alternative but to try to deal with them.
Thank you. We have one other question from Amnon Zohar. He's asked us a sort of a follow-up question to his previous question, Mark. And I'll just again read it. The focus of a Middle East Union that he referred to is not so much on security cooperation as this is happening already.
Mm-hmm.
He asks more about how about free trade, free movement, technology exchange, climate change mitigations, water resources, and so on. What are your thoughts about that in terms of regional cooperation?
Well, as I say, I think the prospects of cooperation, particularly kind of cooperation on an ad hoc basis, not institutionalized in some kind of formal structure, are improving all the time, and we're seeing evidence of that already. You know, it's people who've been thinking about regionalism and regional organization for a long time have always remarked that the Middle East was the only region in the world that didn't have a pretense at regional organization. I mean, David and I tried to work on this, was it 30 years ago, David? Something like that. You know, there's an organization of African unity that turned into the African Union, and there's the Organization of American States, and there's ASEAN, and who knows what, not to speak of Europe, of course. Only the Middle East never even had a pretense, and most of those institutions, by the way, in terms of their practical functioning, were a bit defective or deficient, but at least people had consciousness of regionalism. It didn't even exist in the Middle East. And the truth is, I still don't think it does. At least I haven't seen any evidence of it or any initiatives by anybody to try to organize it. But you do have growing, I think, evidence of at least informal cooperation, coalitions of the like-minded. You know, you have these informal groupings, one of which is, for want of a better term, the bad guys, what King Hussein of Jordan long ago referred to as the Shiite Crescent. And then you have an informal Islamic bloc, which is not really a bloc, it's mostly Turkey and Qatar. And then you have the other one, which is sort of the like-minded or a nascent or emerging block of like-minded, which is, I mean, I hate this term moderate, because if you were, I don't know, a civil rights activist in Saudi Arabia, you wouldn't call Saudi Arabia moderate, but people who are states with administrations that are interested in modernizing and empowering consumer society and access to the outside world and interaction with the outside world and with others like-minded within the region. Yes, it's sometimes called the moderate Sunni states, which, I don't know, there are some Israelis who think Israel's a moderate Sunni state too. But they're the ones who interact, not institutionally, but even formally, in a kind of nascent regional organization, for want of a better term. We don't have yet periodic summit meetings and foreign ministers conferences and a secretariat with 1,000 redundant bureaucrats or anything else. but you do have this consultation and back and forth and agreements, ad hoc agreements. Yes, I think it's a promising development. It never existed at all until five years ago.
That's sort of bringing us near to the end, unless Dylan or John or David have any other thoughts or questions they'd like to address and at this point. And if not, then I think we've really.
May I make one more
Sure,
comment?
by all means, please.
I'm told, although I don't have any personal firsthand knowledge of it, I'm told by people who don't have gray or white hair or none at all, that there is a lot of interaction on social networks among young people in the Middle East. And it's not hostile interaction.
And that would bode well for future interactions among those societies.
Yes.
So
That's a positive. Sorry, David.
Yeah, you've opened the door. I just have to ask one more thing then, Mark. So social media, that kind of interactions. Do you foresee now moving above ground to we used to call it track 2 diplomacy or track 1.5, more interaction among universities, among academics, not just in a meeting in some other part of the world, but actually
Yes.
taking on collaborative research, whether it's in science or the social sciences.
Yes,
And
we already have some of that, David. We do.
No, I know, but is it deepening and where and if it is starting to be more mobilized, where is it coming from? You know, I mean, here in the West, so-called West, whether it's Europe, the UK, North America,
Mhm.
there's a lot of effort, as you know, to try and block cooperation between academics, including between academics here and those in Israel.
Mhm.
It usually hasn't amounted to much of an impediment, but it is nevertheless something that's significantly and strong enough to be disturbing.
Yeah.
So is this happening? Are Israelis able to initiate it? Or are you starting to get more invitations and more collaboration throughout the region emerging from other regional actors?
Well, there are some kind of indigenous initiatives, yes. Cooperation or contact between university faculties, research institutes. Sometimes they're encouraged by third parties or they're financed by third parties, but not always. And there are also kind of functional cooperation agreements between elements of civil society. I mean, there is an ecological network of people consulting, talking to each other and trying to meet. And there are social networks concerned with issues of water. And those are kind of encouraging signs. And there are also, by the way, government initiatives as well by states that have bought in to one degree or another to the normalization paradigm. I don't know if you've heard about the Energy for Water deal, which was promoted by the Americans, but basically involved action by the UAE, Jordan, and Israel. That's the kind of thing, as I say, kind of growing multilateralism, which is an encouraging sign.
Right.
Thank you. I think that brings us to the close. We've ended on I think a positive note in terms of where the future is going. I want to thank you, Mark, for being with us at this time and for sharing your insights and your analysis with us. And I want to turn it over now to Rabbi Goodman to close our session. And Rabbi Goodman.
Hi. Yes, thank you everyone for your insight, for your expertise, for your time. Begin with a word of gratitude, and perhaps it's appropriate to end with a word of gratitude as well. First and foremost, to everyone who's joining us here live in the session, as well as taking the time to watch the recording. Also, a word to our promotional partners at Arts of Canada, Canadian Zionist Federation, the Israel and Golda Kuczynski Center for Jewish Studies at York University, Kashitsky, sorry, ARTSA, and the Reform Jewish Community of Canada. And a special word of thanks to Helena and David Fine for the gift of sponsorship to make this all possible. Next week, we will be gathering on March 4th to talk with a Palestinian doctor from Oxford University, Ahmad Sami Khalidi. At his request, it was we're not going to be recording that session, so he has the ability to speak freely. So I do hope that you will mark your calendars and make a point to join us live. That is next week, next Friday at noon Eastern. With that, thank you again, Mark Anshin, for leading the discussion. Thank you, Mark Heller, for joining us. And that does it for this week. So thank you all, and we will see you again shortly. Take care.
Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom.
Shalom, Mark. All the best.
Thank you.
Be in touch.